Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Design in Dialogue. We will have a 45 minutes conversation with Alexandra and followed by Q&A. We'll also be recording this and post it on Vimeo later. We're also going to mute everyone just to ensure clarity in the background. And if you want to ask Alexandra any questions, please feel free to type them down in the chat box. And let's turn to Glenn Adamson.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And hello there, Alexandra. Good morning to you.
Hi everyone.
Great to see you. You're calling us in from Brooklyn, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Great, okay. Just to repeat something Lucy said there, please put your questions in the chat box on the side and we'll get back to them in the last 15 minutes. And also, if you don't mind letting us know where you are zooming in from, that would be great. We are in fact talking about space today, public and otherwise, so it'd be great to know where you're sitting as you're listening. Alexandra, how have the last couple of months been for you?
They've been okay, actually. I keep saying to people, like, nobody should be worried about me. I feel like my husband and I, like, we both already work from home, so we're very used to being at home, and my kids are tweens, and they've actually been really wonderful about the online schooling and about amusing themselves. And so I feel super lucky and privileged that we don't have a lot of the pressures that a lot of other people have, especially parents of smaller children.
Yeah, I was going to inquire after your children because one of the things we'll be talking about is design and children based on your book, Design of Childhood. And one thing that really impressed me in your introduction to that book was that you said when you became a mother, you entered the world of stuff. And you said something like sleepy stuff, messy stuff, all kinds of stuff. And I was sort of imagining you still surrounded by toys. I don't know if that's actually the case.
Oh my God, that is completely actually the case. So I'm sitting in my desk chair right now, but right behind me is this whole village of Playmobil dollhouses that my daughter has set up in my office because you need a lot of room for dollhouses and there wasn't room in any other room. So sometimes she'll just come up here and play with all of her dollhouses on the floor. So they're kind of like this little village around the edge of the room. And one of the other things I talk about in the book is how important it is, like, not to put all of your kids' toys away all the time. Like, sometimes they need to have ongoing play that can be more than for an hour or an afternoon. So I decided that the dollhouses, were this kind of village that is like staying alive even when it's not being played with. So I'm fine with it. It's clean. It's just like not tidy necessarily.
It is also fantastically interesting that a professional architectural critic would be surrounded by miniature architecture that presents itself as a kind of model of life.
Yes. Well, I have to say one of the, this is just like how everything connects, but one of the dollhouses is a vintage Fisher-Price A-frame dollhouse, which is a toy that I coveted when I was little and I didn't have one. And I bought one on Etsy and I started tweeting about it, and that turned into this story that I wrote, I think 2 or 3 years ago for Curbed, all about A-frames and why people are obsessed with A-frames. So I feel like even when I'm buying toys for my kids, like, most of them can end up being a tax write-off at this point. So.
This is the great thing about being a design critic, right? Everything is a form of research.
Yeah. Even when you're not paying attention. I mean, usually I actually think those subconscious things that you buy and then later you realize are the perfect detail for your story, like, make it all better. It makes it seem like you have a great pattern for your life, even if you don't.
Well, in this spirit, let's go ahead and start looking at some images. And we're actually going to start not by talking about the design of childhood, but a previous book that you wrote called Writing About Architecture, a book I really love, which gives you this kind of X-ray vision into thinking about how a text about architecture can be built. And it's also, I find, it's actually a very helpful text because it gives you not only the content of the architectural criticism in question, but it also lets you think about structure and voice and methodology in a really accessible way. So those people who are watching that don't have the book, I super recommend it. And I just wanted to ask you, really, in general, what are your thoughts about being an architecture critic? Because it's such a rare thing to be. You're such a rare bird. And I wonder how you, I guess, first of all, how you became one, and then also what you think about it as a profession.
Sure. So I should say, especially because I think some of my former students might be in the audience today, that book is based on a class that I taught on writing architecture criticism first at NYU and then in the design criticism program at the School of Visual Arts. So, I mean, the structure of the book is very much how I structure my classes, where we would read, you know, key pieces of architecture criticism from famous authors, and then I would kind of break it down for students, and then they would do their own writing. And so I feel like any clarity that it has is from having to explain things, you know, multiple times out loud and in writing to students, which is always like the great learning process of teaching. But yeah, I wrote that book after I'd been an architecture critic, honestly, for not that many years. I first had the idea that a person could be an architecture critic in high school. My mother gave me a collection of Ada Louise Huxtable's writings, and Ada Louise Huxtable has always been kind of like my avatar for the architecture critic. She was the longtime critic for the New York Times and then for the Wall Street Journal. So I had this idea that you could, like, an architecture critic was a thing to be, and that there was this famous woman whose like name, if you squinted your eyes, like looked a little bit like mine, which I liked. And so I had that idea, you know, all through college. And I was a double major in literature and architecture in college, and I was an arts editor at the school paper. So I kind of had this like double track in architecture and writing like the whole time through college. And then when I graduated, I got a job as an editorial assistant at New York Magazine. And at first that was just answering the phones, but eventually I became like a culture editor and writer for New York Magazine. And I kept wanting to go back to just writing about architecture and to be more of a critic and less of a reporter. But it took about 10 years for that to happen. And I got a PhD along the way. I don't know, it's like, there's so many paths to get to being an architecture critic. And I guess my main thing about criticism is I feel like it's really personal. You know, which critic is your favorite is personal. Like the way that the best critics write is really from their personal perspective. And so that means that everyone has a different journey to get there. And my journey was really through journalism, and then in getting my PhD through like a really deep grounding in 20th century architecture history. I had a little bit of imposter syndrome. So I felt like if I had a PhD, I would know everything, which, you know, of course is ridiculous, but it has helped a lot. And one of the more amazing things is, you know, I mostly in my day-to-day writing write about contemporary architecture, but like so many of the architects that I wrote about in my dissertation, which was about corporate architecture and design, come up again and again, including Eero Saarinen, including Isamu Noguchi, who's on the cover of the book. And I mean, this is his red cube, which is in Lower Manhattan, you know, with a kid sitting under it. And, you know, when I wrote this book and when my brother actually took this photograph for the cover of the book, I had no idea that I would end up writing about kids in Noguchi's years later. So again, like, it's just an example of how little subconscious things can come back to like haunt and enrich your writing.
And it all joins up somehow.
Yeah,
Alexandra, can I just ask you about one thing about architecture criticism that I've wondered about is what the effect of it is? Because if we think about art criticism, one could possibly argue that that has a very strong and direct effect on artists' careers, although people discuss whether that's the case. Certainly film critics, there's been a long discourse about whether it might have an influence on the opening weekend. And I wonder, in the case of a discipline that's as slow and highly capitalized as architecture, whether you think, bluntly, whether you think that criticism sort of slides off the edifice of architecture without having much of an impact, or whether you feel like it has a long, deep effect.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, I would hate to think that it's just slid off of the edifice. I mean, you know, there are a lot of us working very hard to try to make sure that that doesn't happen. I think that the difficult truth about architecture criticism is that yes, it has no effect on the building at hand if what you're doing is writing about a building that's already built. But it can have an effect on how things are built in the future. And for most people, including me, a built example is much easier to think about and kind of deal with in both a political and intellectual way than the abstraction of a rendering or a plan or something like that. So it's like, no matter how critical you are of a project along the way, it's often not until the thing is built that other people can kind of share your feeling as a critic about it. I mean, that's not always true. Like, we have an amazing recent example in, you know, the fact that Sidewalk Labs has given up their proposal to redevelop a huge section of Toronto. And, you know, they've given various reasons for it, but like a very, like a vigorous critical response in Toronto by both, you know, kind of public space and like data privacy activists really, I think, had a huge made a huge difference in like how that project went forward. So it's not impossible that criticism can't make a difference like that, but I think usually the influence is on projects going into the future.
And maybe even generationally, that what you write now might affect the architects of tomorrow because they're literally in school now, that kind of thing. But let me let's look at some examples. We thought it would be appropriate to talk about Michael Sorkin, who unfortunately died earlier this year. And he's one of the many voices that you include in that writing about architecture book. And what you particularly chose from him, I imagine it was a difficult choice because he wrote so many fascinating things, especially in the sort of culture war 1980s. But he wrote this amazing piece in 1985 about the proposed renovation, or not really renovation, but extension to the Marcel Breuer Whitney building, which of course is now in transition from being occupied by the Met to the Frick, the Whitney having decamped to downtown. And I'm just going to mention something that I really, really love from the original Sorkin, which is that the stepped facade of the building reminded him of Marcel Marceau, the mime artist, pressing himself up against the invisible wall of Madison Avenue, which I just thought was a lovely image. And I'll kind of never look at the building without thinking of that, you know. But what he's specifically talking about is this amazing shocking proposal by Michael Graves. So I wonder if you could just talk about this, what Sorkin said about it, and also your own thoughts about it.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, like, I was just so sorry to hear of Michael Sorkin's death. Like, he was a huge influence on my writing, and in more recent years, we had many, you know, like wonderful personal encounters. Like, but I first encountered him through his writing, and specifically through the collection of his writings, Exquisite Corpse, which is still my favorite book of his, and I would really urge everyone to write it. And that book collects a lot of his essays from when he was writing for the Village Voice in the 80s. And it's really, it's when he's developing his voice, and he's also specifically trying to kind of take architecture and architecture criticism away from the establishment. Like, up till then, like, the most famous architecture critics had been writing for the New York Times and the New Yorker, and he's sort of saying, you know, architecture criticism can come from this other place. It can come from the Village. It can come from the Village Voice. And I feel like this piece, Save the Whitney, really just shows him doing so much in such a short amount of time. Because, you know, first of all, like, as an, you know, architect and person of taste, he's just horrified by this addition. Like, you know, from pure aesthetics, like, he says something like about how Graves, you know, makes the Whitney symmetrical, which is like absolutely antithetical to modern architecture, but of course is a huge part of postmodern architecture. So it's like, just from Graves's first move by putting the entrance to the new Whitney, like between the Breuer building and the new Graves addition, and making those two additions the same size, he's like completely screwed up like the whole point of the original building. So like, that's an aesthetic criticism. Then he goes into, you know, a longer discussion of, you know, the internal functioning of the building and kind of Graves and postmodernism and what they're trying to do. But the like especially Sorkin-esque thing about this essay comes at the end, where he starts to talk about how, in fact, like, his criticism, all of this aesthetic criticism doesn't necessarily mean anything, because the kind of thing that actually gets buildings stopped is something more political. And in this case, he thinks that the historic district, the politics of the historic district that the Whitney Museum is in, the Upper East Side Historic District, are going to get the Whitney saved, because Graves wants to take out this row of fairly boring historic brownstones that's next to Breuer's Whitney. And he thinks that the people of the neighborhood won't stand for that. And that, in fact, is what happened. You know, this project, and then ultimately later proposed additions to the Whitney, were all stopped by the politics of the Upper East Side and the preservation politics that kind of value ordinary, like, fabric brownstones over, you know, such an amazing 20th century like work of architecture like Breuer's Whitney. So I just love that little twist at the end where he's like, yeah, you know, basically like, I can say like yada, 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 but like, that's not what actually counts in New York City.
I think also I like describing that as Sorkin-esque, but I've often seen you do that too, sort of bringing contextual realpolitik to the conversation, like the way that you wrote about Hudson Yards recently, for example. Speaking of additions to the Whitney that didn't happen, we thought it would be, this is of course post-dates Sorkin's essay, but we thought it would be criminal not to show this absolutely extraordinary project proposed by Rem Koolhaas when the Whitney was again thinking about extending itself. And you said to me before we started the conversation, Alexandra, that you're actually going to go on public record as sort of liking this.
Oh, I love this, actually. I think this is one of the best additions ever. I mean, first of all, in this model, you can see that row of boring brownstones. And if you went to the Whitney, you know, in before times, they used to have their museum shop in the one that's like right next to the building. So like a lot of people have been in those brownstones. But yeah, I love this because to me, this is actually, you know, Koolhaas before we were so mad at him for the Countryside Show and other things. But this is Koolhaas, I felt like really kind of getting into the mindset of Breuer and kind of understanding like the brutal nature of Breuer, and then saying like, how can we put that together in the early 21st century and make something that like is like the Breuer, but also speaks to our time. So it's like a remix, really. And he is also dealing with the realpolitik, like he's preserving the brownstones, he's pulling it back from the street. It's like, you know, it's like he read all the complaints of the community board to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and he's trying to make something that actually in its own kind of like gawky, like maybe somewhat awful way, like conforms to all of their constraints, but is still super Koolhaas OMA.
Yeah, it's like an alien being had read the complaints and said, "Oh, I see what you want."
Yeah, yeah. So it's like he's trying to get them at their own game. So, and I mean, and also like what's Sorkin-esque about that is that it's all like it's serious, but it's also a joke. And one of the things, I was interviewed on 99% Invisible about Sorkin, and one of the things I told them was just the thing that I understood from reading Exquisite Corpse was that criticism could also be funny, and that sometimes it was more effective, like if you could make jokes. Like, this is serious business, but we can also make jokes.
Yeah, or just, you know, thinking of the Koolhaas as a thought bubble, and what is it saying about the Whitney, those kind of simple images. Yeah, or I think you said that it seemed like an inverted comma, like a kind of ironic quote mark over the Whitney, which is a great perception. Let's turn now to the Design of Childhood book, out a couple of years ago, and we'll go through some examples from this relatively quickly, I think. But first, I wanted to just ask you if you could talk a little bit about why you decided to write it, because it's not nominally a book about architecture. So
yeah, well, I mean, I think really, you know, I feel like for years I kept saying like, I want to be an architecture critic. I want to be an architecture critic. Like, someone let me be an architecture critic. But like the minute I became an architecture critic, I was like, oh, but I can't just write about architecture. Like for me, like design is really part of everything. And I'm like a third generation design person. So I grew up with a lot of amazing things in my house and a lot of great conversations. So the idea of just talking about architecture in the sense of just talking about buildings was never really in the cards for me. And then this book really, came out of having my first child. He's 12 now, and starting to encounter and re-encounter the world of childhood things. I would go looking for things that I remember growing up with, like playpens or wooden blocks, and suddenly realize, wait, they changed. Like, I can't find the playpen that like I grew up with, or I can't find the block set that I had in my house. Now there are all these other kinds, and it's like, why are there all those other kinds? Like, was there something wrong with those things? Like, was it safety? Was it education? There were just all these questions that I had. And I honestly felt like because these things were for children, people just hadn't really taken them seriously and hadn't explained like why they were the way they were. And so, yeah, my book is basically trying to explain like why the things that they try to sell you when you have a baby are the way they are. And then expanding out from there into, schools and playgrounds and cities, because one of the points I try to make with the book is that raising children isn't just about consumer choices. It's also about, public choices and public investment choices.
Right. Now, this also builds on the conversation that we had earlier with Darren Alfred and Monica Omniski. And as you said, you wrote for the book for the Serious Play catalog. But I suppose people who are in the design field, if they know about one thing about children's toys, it's Froebel blocks, because of Frank Lloyd Wright famously professing them as an early influence. And in the book, you talk in a super interesting way about the interwoven histories of modernist abstraction and the idea of block play as an appropriate way of bringing children into the world of creativity. And so, of course, here's the Froebel blocks, one of the Froebel gifts. And then you also talk about these maybe less canonical examples.
I mean, these are unit blocks, which were created by a woman named Caroline Pratt, who also founded the City and Country School and in Greenwich Village. And it's like the question I have in my mind is, are these more canonical or less canonical? Because Froebel blocks are the ones, that are at the MoMA and that you see in any book about like the history of children's play, the history of kindergarten. But if you go to any preschool classroom, you don't see the Froebel blocks, you see the unit blocks. And those, in fact, were the wooden blocks that I had in my house growing up. And we have pictures, like Polaroids of me playing with them at home. So why isn't Caroline Pratt talked about as this amazing design influence? Like, why isn't she considered a designer or inventor? She's quite famous in education circles, and she wrote a wonderful, wonderful book that I highly recommend called I Learn from Children. But these unit blocks have kind of been made generic, so we don't understand who their maker is. And I actually came to believe that Caroline Pratt was much smarter about children and how they actually wanted to play and what they actually wanted than Froebel was. And Froebel's teaching methods, which were quite rigid, very German to use the stereotype, were actually heavily interpreted and changed when they came to America by a whole bunch of female kindergarten teachers. So there's this whole kind of male versus female, who's in charge of children's education, like who gets to be an inventor dialogue that I discovered when I started, just like digging into blocks at all. And like, that was amazing because those are all the issues that I like to talk about. And it made me feel even more strongly that unit blocks maybe, should be one of children's first toys, and that they were made and conceived of with such like love and thoughtfulness.
Yeah, one of the things that I found really amazing about the book too was the way that you tracked across time, the way that people's ideas about children and childhood itself were reflected in these successive design ventures. And that is maybe nowhere more exemplified in the story you tell about Zoob, which is this more recent kind of take for the digital era, I almost want to say, about the tradition of block play.
Yeah, I mean, Zoob is actually like slightly pre-digital. It's a 90s toy, but I when you read a lot about toys, especially written by design critics and people in the design profession, there's a lot of fetishization of wood and simplicity, like the kind of those good old fashioned modernist values. And I wanted because I'd observed this honestly with my own kids, I wanted to make sure that I didn't just like fetishize wood as being better, and that I talked about the material consequences and like the differences between wooden toys and plastic toys. So I have a lot about Lego in there. You know, Lego's really famous, but then I also wanted to talk about Zoob, which is this more recent toy designed by a man named Michael Joaquin Gray. And this is also like in the MoMA design collection now. But he observed that, you know, a lot of the classic blocks and building toys, the main principle that they operate under is stacking. Like you're supposed to make something that looks like a building, like everything is like a brick. And he thought, well, you know, that's not the only way things are built in the world. Like our skeletons are also built, our bodies are also built. So what if kids want to build bodies? What if they want to build things that articulate and move? And so this was his solution. Like he made these 5 parts and they click together like the joints in the body. And as I describe in the book, like my son just sort of like got a set of these and started building his own dinosaurs. And like those dinosaurs then could like knock down the block cities. But it created this whole other dialogue for play. And it showed me that he wasn't really that interested in building cities, but he was interested in building. And Zoob provided this conduit to a different kind of building and then a different kind of imagination, which hadn't necessarily been addressed by those earlier systems.
It's so fascinating because it makes me think that this was also the time that, let's say, Neri Oxman was in graduate school and thinking about the biodesign, so that those kinds of shifts, seeing them side by side. And there's much more to say about this idea of the block as a unit of child learning and kind of formal experimentation. But we thought we'd also talk a little bit about the stories that you tell in the book about playground design, which are equally fascinating. And maybe one thing to say is that the book is structured as a series of kind of shells. So you start with the toy and the idea of the, you know, playing in the room, and then you go out gradually from that to the playground and eventually to the whole domain of urban space.
Yeah, I always tend to think of things in a scalar way. My dissertation, the title of it was Tower, Typewriter, and Trademark. So that went in the other direction, but it was still like small, medium, and large. So my book is also kind of small, medium, and large. But yeah, the chapter that I wrote on playgrounds has been one of the most popular, like one of the things that I've been asked to speak about the most. And this slide is just an image from Life magazine from, I think, the early 1940s of a play street in New York City. And you know, one of the things that I started to track in the book was kind of how much room children had been given in cities. And it turned out that in the early part of the century, in a lot of neighborhoods, after school every day, they had blocked off streets to create play streets. You know, it's like they didn't have community centers and not all neighborhoods had access to playgrounds. So they just let kids have the streets after school. And, you know, at a really like large scale across the city. And I thought that was kind of amazing because, you know, if you propose that today, people would be astonished and be like, no way, like, you know, that would destroy traffic. It would like turn, you know, create Carmageddon, blah, blah, blah. But at one time, there had been this provision for kids on the streets. And I feel like this is very relevant to, you know, what's happening now and what we're going to talk about a little later. In terms of like what's happening in cities during Corona. But just to have this obviously historic image showing kids playing in the street seemed really important to me, just to kind of show like kids have always been there playing, and they were given this public space.
And then you also talk about, again, that theme of modernist design and a kind of, I suppose, advanced aesthetic theory being applied to the playground. So here, for example, we're looking at the work of Aldo van Eyck, which I didn't know about before looking at his playground.
Oh yeah, Aldo van Eyck is amazing. He's well known in architectural circles. He's kind of a cult figure, but people tend to focus more on his buildings and not on his playgrounds, which is, you know, like the story of everything, as I found out. But he worked for the city of Amsterdam during the post-war era, and he created over 700 playgrounds that were scattered across the city through this kind of creation of a kit of parts. This is the Dykstra Playground, and you can see some of the parts that he deployed over and over. Like there's the hoop-like climbing structure. There's always a sandbox. This one is triangular. There are also like round and square sandboxes, and they always have that really thick edge around them that creates a bench. And then he also has these things that I usually call like concrete toadstools, just like little rounds of concrete. And you can see in this image, kids are kind of like playing a ball game around them, but so they can be seats, they can be goals, like each of his parts had like many different uses, and he really like reduced them down to like the simplest language. And then for each playground, he would kind of deploy them differently. Like no two of them are the same, but they use this very simple set of designs. So I feel like, you know, Aldo van Eyck was very attuned to children. And so he's kind of saying like, okay, take a play street, but make it more permanent. Like it needs some elements to kind of hold, you know, hold the line, hold the edge of the sidewalk and make sure people know this is children's domain, but don't like junk it up with bright colors or sculptures shaped like elephants or any of that. Like really keep it kind of as low key and I would say infrastructural as you can.
Yeah, it really prompts the thought that children are actually, as it turns out, the ideal audience for mid-century abstraction, which is fascinating. But I also, I really loved the points you made in the book about the fact that kids had been playing in, speaking of junk, but they were actually playing in these kind of, you know, wastelands left after the war. And this idea that, you know, kind of totally random accretion of wreckage might be the ideal playground if you could just make it safe. And there's also a very interesting kind of interplay there between the random and the very intentional.
Yeah, I mean, Van Eyck is designing these playgrounds in Amsterdam at the same time as first in Copenhagen, and then it spreads around the room. There's this junk playground movement around the world, led by this fascinating woman named Lady Allen of Hurtwood. I mean, she became kind of their chief popularizer. Yeah, and those playgrounds were, you know, vacant lots, empty lots, often in cities that had been bombed out. I mean, the Dykstra Playground is actually on like the site of a destroyed building. And she observed in Copenhagen, and then she brought back this idea that, you know, maybe kids can build their own playground infrastructure, and maybe it doesn't need to be permanent, and maybe the play is really kind of inventing something new on this site every day. And you know, a lot of people that are junk playground partisans don't believe in designing anything for kids. Like they would feel like Aldo van Eyck, you know, took too much away from the children in designing this playground. I was never able to kind of come down on like one side or the other of that argument, because I think his playgrounds are amazing and junk playgrounds are also amazing. But yes, it is interesting that there was this really kind of like a foment of thought about what children need and like what their place in the future city should be, you know, in the, you know, decades after the war.
Well, let's look at just a couple more examples. Moving next to Richard Dattner, who's another figure that you talk about in the book, and creating these kind of playscapes that have a sort of almost a geological quality. So could you tell us a bit about Dattner?
Yeah, so Dattner was a pretty young New York City architect who was lucky to be married to a woman who had studied child psychology. So when his clients, the Lauders, said, we want to, you know, give the children of New York City a new playground in Central Park, he consulted with his wife, and he was also already aware of the work of Van Eyck, as well as some unbuilt playground designs by Osamu Noguchi. And so he, you know, kind of put those things together and created, you know, probably the best known example of, you know, a modernist playground that he built for Central Park. And, you know, some of this still exists. And then he was able to design a number of others. And there are other people, including Paul Friedberg, who designed similar things at the time. Oh yeah, and this is one of the interesting things. So there's a little bit of a nomenclature problem. Like the junk playgrounds were also known as adventure playgrounds, but then Dattner's playground is called an adventure playground, but there's no junk there. because it was in the middle of New York City. So what Datner did was basically design his own junk. Like he designed these parts, which are called play panels, that were actually stored in one of the pyramids that you saw on the previous slide. And these parks had play workers that staffed them every day. So the play worker would get there in the morning and get out pens and paper and get out these play panels, and then the kids could use them to build their own structures outside in the sandbox. So there was still this sense of kids being able to invent their own play, even though there was a bit more of an elaborate structure already laid out for them. So I feel like this was kind of the best of both worlds. It was optimized for an urban setting that would be pretty high trafficked and all of that. And I feel like it's important to remind people that once upon a time, New York City Parks Department had the budget for play workers. It had the budget for like these deployable toys, like all of these things that now, again, people act like are impossible.
Yeah, I love the sort of pseudo oxymoronic concept of a play worker as well as, somebody who oversees the children.
Yeah, there's some really beautiful writing about play work, and I've gotten to know a few play workers. If anyone listening is interested, there's an online like free document called the Play Work Primer that talks about it. And the play worker really has a very specific role, which is to kind of like hang back and observe and only intervene when necessary. And it's very different than the position of the parent. Like there's a kind of level of emotion that's taken out of it. And it's also different from a teacher who is kind of paid to intervene. And yeah, I find the whole discussion about kind of like how you foster children's play very poetic and interesting. And there are a lot of people that are very eloquent about that.
It reminds me of the great sign from Governor's Island that you cite that says something like, your children do not need your advice or suggestions.
Yes, the children are fine without your advice or suggestions. I mean, I'm actually, sorry, I just have to say, like, I'm actually kind of practicing that in my own home now, in the digital realm, in the sense that, like, my children are amusing themselves all afternoon. Like, they do their schoolwork in the morning and then the afternoon is their own. And I don't 100% know what they're doing, but I keep reminding myself of that sign. And I'm like, well, if they're doing something that's making them happy, like they're exploring some other world, like, a digital world, and I have all the parental restrictions on, like, that is good. Like, they don't need me to be bombarding them with like 1,000 like museum website links. Like, if they're finding things that interest them, like, that's good. Like, that's independence, that's exploration, even if it's in the digital realm as opposed to the physical realm.
Well, I think there's some real wisdom there. Thank you, Alexandra, for all the parents watching. Let's just wrap up the Design Childhood with a couple of last examples of playgrounds in action.
Yeah, so this is an image I took in Tokyo in 2016, and it was used to illustrate a story that I wrote for the New Yorker about junk playgrounds. Like, one of the things that's difficult for a design critic is, junk playgrounds are messy and they aren't always aesthetic. And so like a lot of images of them don't look like anything. So I keep using this one because it does look like something. It's like you can see that the kids, in this case, the kids were building their own market and they were going to sell things out of that the next week. So they had like chalked those lines on the ground and they were each building their own stall. And then they were also going to make something to sell at the stall. So it was this whole kind of like ongoing multi-stage process. And there were kids, from the neighborhood and beyond coming to this junk playground every day. And yeah, I felt like really, really energized by their effort and by the idea of the junk playground as really this ongoing project for children.
It's also interesting there, though, reminds me of things that people have said about Lego as a kind of training in capitalism. And so the fact that they're making this kind of quasi-commercial space is fascinating.
I guess so, but it was all handmade objects. So maybe it goes back to, how you feel about Etsy and like Etsy, like before and after it became professionalized and all sorts of other things. I feel like if the kids were like baking brownies to sell to each other in their like little, stalls that they built themselves. Like, I can't really see that as a bad thing.
Absolutely. Childhood barter economy. That's, we could all sign on to that. Okay, and last but not least, you have a positive example to hold up for us.
Yeah, so the last chapter of my book is about children in the city. And I was trying, in that chapter, I was really trying to take examples from around the world about how cities had been tweaked so that children could have more independence. Like, it was clear that at one point in the early 20th century, children, had more right to roam and like were able to go more places on their own. And really, like, the number one reason they can't do that now is because cars are bigger and faster and take up more room in cities. So people kept saying, like, well, is there one place that has done it right? Like, people really do love, concrete built examples. And I keep having to say, well, there isn't, one place that's gotten everything right, but one neighborhood I went to that really made me see the possibilities was Falls Creek South in Vancouver. And this is actually the drawing for the competition entry by the winning team for the design of Falls Creek South, which the competition was in the mid 1970s. And I think you can probably tell that just from like these graphics, which I think are wonderful. And you can also tell that I think it's Thompson, Berwick, and Pratt, the planners of this neighborhood, were heavily influenced by Christopher Alexander and Italian hill towns. And there's this whole era of trying to make planning that looks more organic, that makes a new place look like it was built over time. And I have to say that what was actually built isn't quite as wonderful as this drawing, but it makes really effective use of courtyards and kind of housing with stepped levels so that people, even on the third floor, have good sight lines to the ground. And they're both truly public spaces and semi-public spaces, which are really important in terms of parents like having differing amounts of control over children of different ages. So, like, there's no one place that's gotten it right, but I just felt like this at least showed people taking a really, really smart stab at making a neighborhood that was truly accessible for children, to be independent from ages like, 5 through teens.
And did you bring your kids there?
I didn't, but I mean, one of the wonderful things that happened was I'd asked the people who kind of run essentially like the community board there to give me a tour. And one of them decided to pull his kids out of school that day so that they could talk to me too, because as he said to me, he was like, I felt like this could be, educational, like this could count as an educational experience. So I had these two kids, I can't remember how old, they were like 7 and 10, as part of this whole group of people that took me around. And so, they showed me a creek where they built things with rocks. They showed me the convenience store that they could walk to. Like, they showed me all the kids stuff, and it was perfect. It was like, I wouldn't have been able to ask for that. I wouldn't have asked for that, but I felt like the people there kind of intuited what I wanted and gave it to me. So that was amazing.
Also, it's just wonderful to think that the child is the real expert here, and that comes up over and over again in your book, that it's not a matter of legislating to them, it's a matter of creating a situation in which they can find themselves. Well, let's just quickly talk about a couple of other things that you've been up to. One book on design research, the fascinating progressive store that was published a few years ago, and then it's also got some connections to your next book, I guess it is, which is about mall design. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I wrote this book with Jane Thompson, who was one of the owners of Design Research, which was one of the first modern design stores in the US, and also introduced Marimekko to the world. And this is the Design Research building in Cambridge, which was designed by Ben Thompson, who founded the store, and is just a really major example of late modern design. A lot of people, for a long time there was a Crate and Barrel in it, and so I think a lot of people shopped at that Crate and Barrel in Harvard Square. But you can see Ben Thompson really wanted the whole building to be a showcase for the kind of stuff that they sold, and it was really effective. So yeah, no, I threw that in there. First of all, there are a lot of people that shopped at Design Research, and my mother and grandmother shopped at Design Research, and and people out there know that I'm obsessed with Mary Mecco, and it's like all because of this project. But it's also because, you know, my new book is on the history and future of shopping malls. And like figuring out that I was actually very interested in retail took me a long time. Like I wouldn't have said a few years ago, oh, I'm interested in shopping, oh, I'm interested in retail. But the minute I started researching the book on shopping malls, I realized, oh wait, I wrote a whole book about a store. Like what was I thinking? Of course I'm interested in retail. And then the truth of it is that like right after Ben Thompson designed the Design Research Store, he started working on the plans for Faneuil Hall Marketplace in Boston, which this is an image of, and he and Jane did that together. And Faneuil Hall became a really important example of urban pedestrian mall and urban adaptive reuse that kind of followed on the suburban mallification of America. And so I realized that, oh, you know, I think it's going to be chapter 4, is going to be all about Ben and Jane Thompson and Faneuil Hall and how quickly that became a model for other cities. So it was like I'd already done the research for that chapter without realizing it when I was writing the DR book and spending a lot of time hanging out with Jane Thompson.
Mm. And you have a couple more mall images for us too. Yeah.
Yeah, this is where the book is going to start. This is Southdale Mall, designed by Victor Gruen, which opened in Edina, Minnesota, in 1956. And you can only sort of see it in the background, but you know, this is the main the garden court of the mall, and there's a Harry Bertoia sculpture there, and in the foreground there's an aviary. And I think this isn't maybe the best picture, but I do think it shows kind of how charming and wonderful and like human scaled some of those early malls were. And that's something that they've gotten away from, but that was really important to Gruen when he was inventing the type.
So that tower on the left in the foreground is actually for birds?
Yes, yes. And weirdly, there were a lot of live animals in early malls. Like I read this book that is a guide for people who are running shopping centers, and there's a whole section on like having bunnies in your mall at Easter and like having a petting zoo, and like there was this whole level of programming that I think is hard for people to imagine today, but there was just like a lot of care and tending and like constant creation of like what sound like pretty amazing events in a lot of the early malls.
So I suppose this brings us to the last part of our conversation, which is that writing about the mall at this point could be seen as possibly an elegiac act, because you know the wonder of the early mall and that idea of, you know, being alive with animals and small scale, kind of human centered, and then we go through this rise and possibly fall of the shopping mall as a form, particularly post-COVID, as we'll get to in a second. But even before that, we obviously had the great shift of retail to online. So is that part of why you're focusing on the book right now?
Well, I mean, I'm focusing on the book right now because originally, like, I was supposed to write the whole book by the end of the year. Like, the mall book was supposed to come out for Christmas 2021. So I was supposed to write the whole manuscript this year, and like I had my book advance and I was working away when all of this happened. And by the way, I just feel like I need to tell people this image is of Horton Plaza in San Diego, which was designed by Jurdy and opened in the early 80s and is now undergoing a transformation. So yeah, my book was already going to talk about kind of the past of malls, like why they were originally created, and like the death of malls. But I was planning to end on kind of a hopeful note, because in truth, like not all malls are dead. And like as I've been doing my research, I really realized that there, you know, like is a human need for gathering, and in a lot of places that don't have urban centers, malls have provided that place for a long time. And you know, anytime I talk to somebody about doing the book, like the first thing they come back to me is like, oh my God, you know, when I was a teenager, I spent all my time hanging out at the food court at like XYZ mall. So like this is a very, very common experience for people who grew up in the 70s and 80s in the US. So there's actually a deep well of feeling about malls, even though they're so often talked about as this kind of like capitalist hellscape that like deserves its own demise. So basically, I don't believe that that's true, because like there is a lot of personal feeling associated with malls. And I also don't believe that they're all dead, but I do believe that not all of them are great, and that in some way in the future we'll be able to use them almost like a natural resource. Like there's a tremendous like amount of square footage sunk into malls, and like once they were built at the edge of town, like now often they're absorbed, like they're in the first ring suburb, and cities are sprawling out to like third and fourth ring suburbs. So I think that like the space that they take up may be a resource for the future, and that hopefully they can take on some of like the community and public role that they were originally intended to have.
Like our own Roman Forum sitting there in the first ring.
A little bit. And actually this week I've been writing a bit about ruin porn as it is associated with malls, because there's a lot of like mall ruin porn photography, and kind of how much I hate it, and like how different people like tweak it in different ways. So yes.
Well, let's just finish up before we get to questions with your thoughts about the impact of the coronavirus on public space. I thought you would be a fantastic person to ask about this. And of course, we all have our own thoughts and anxieties about it, but I thought it would be great to talk to somebody who's been thinking about urban spaces actively as you have for so long. So what are your thoughts about what's happening out there right now?
Yeah.
What will happen?
Well, I mean, one of the first questions people asked me, you know, like once the quarantine started, was like, what is it going to mean for public space? And I gave an answer to Politico that talked about how I thought parks were going to immediately become like an even more valuable resource. And I put this slide in, and the next one, they both show Brooklyn Bridge Park. So this part of Brooklyn Bridge Park that you can see now is the part where I'm taking my daily walk. The previous slide was the playground of Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is closed because too many people touching things. So like we can walk in the park, but we can't go in the playground in the park. And I feel like that prediction, which is now like over a month old, has been borne out. And like one of the, you know, like most interesting aspects of how people are planning during quarantine, and then also thinking about the future of the city afterward, has been their relationship to public space, and how valuable things like a promenade, you know, and this is the one near my house, so this is where I've been going, have become. But it's also important to recognize that, you know, not everyone in cities like has the same access to a previously existing promenade, and that we need to provide those spaces for people that aren't already close to a big park, or, you know, streets with wide sidewalks and all of these other things, because, you know, the distribution of parks in cities has been inequitable for a long time. And so in some ways, some of the planning around giving people more space in cities like only kind of doubles those inequities.
And we're now also seeing these ad hoc solutions like this one from Domino Park in Brooklyn, which is so amazing, which I suppose in some ways could be seen either, depending on how you look at it, as an image of absolute equity, like everybody has their own circle, but also as a sort of strange, you know, return of the imagery of the encircled like walled city or the hill town, you know, this idea of security and public space being enforced by design.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think that people don't really know what 6 feet is. So I think that I would say, you know, tactical urbanism, tactical parkism like this can be really helpful. You know, things like spray paint and tape and, you know, plastic jersey barriers to kind of show people like where it's safe to walk, like how they can both be outside, which they very much need to be like psychologically, how they can be outside safely, like all of that is great. I think what starts to worry me is, kind of which parks have the personnel to like spray paint 6-foot circles, and then who is enforcing them. Because like, as we've already seen, like if open streets and getting pedestrians more access and cyclists more access to cities, if that becomes part of the police department's domain, it's often Black and brown residents of cities that are more heavily policed. And like we can't have everyone become like the quarantine cops, and in a way, like, we shouldn't have the cops be quarantine cops, like because like that's not a way to get this equitably enforced and to make everyone in a city feel like they have the right to access that space.
Okay.
So it's like, Domino Park, this park is on the Williamsburg waterfront, but like what's happening in other parts, away from the like waterfront in Brooklyn that tends to be richer? Like, are those parks being divided up so that more people can have access, and not being policed so that people don't feel comfortable?
Well, this actually relates to the first question that we could take, which basically applies the same thing to the question of the playground. So what do you think is going to happen to children's playgrounds with the effect of COVID? And this is a question from D. Hutt. I don't know if,
Okay.
That
is a tough question. I mean, I feel like it was the right thing to shut playgrounds down, because there's really no way. I mean, kids touch everything. They touch each other. They play close to each other. And so if it's close contact that is spreading the virus, then, we have to make spaces that spread children out rather than bring them close together. That said, like, I think in some of the new spaces that are opening up in whatever the new version of play streets are, like, we have to make space for children to play out there. Maybe it's more kids like on their own scooters or on their own bikes, so they're not so close to each other. Maybe it's like going through all of the games and thinking about like which games kids can play and be socially distanced. But I mean, people with small kids are just really having so much trouble being cooped up in small places. Like, there has to be a smarter way to provision space for kids to play out. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about a little bit is just materials. Like, I think we're all going to be much more suspicious of slick materials like plastic and metal now, because those seem to be places where the virus can live longer. And maybe we're going to go back, and I would say this is really across both adult and childhood design, to wood and things that are rougher and that like the virus finds it hard to cling to. And in fact, like in that way, things like junk playgrounds where it's like mud and water and wood would actually be better than playgrounds where surfaces are fixed and smooth. So maybe, going forward, there could be ways, for kids to play out with junk in a socially distanced way that would give them an outlet.
It's so wonderfully counterintuitive because, of course, the whole idea of sanitation was crucial to the modernist preference for those hard, shiny materials in the first place. And it turns out it's exactly wrong. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, early nursery design, like basically like linoleum and enameled metal and all of that, like made its way into the home partially through nurseries because people wanted to, have surfaces that they could wipe down. So yeah.
Right. We also have another question from Jamie Goldsboro. Jamie, do you want to call in, or shall I just read this out? I'm not sure if Jamie's actually on the video, but
I am here. I can
hey, Jamie.
If you want. Sorry it's so long. Okay. Hi, Alexandra. Early in the conversation, you were talking about getting started. I'm sorry if you hear that noise.
It's all right. Carry on.
Okay, our sound has a
bit of realism.
You were talking about getting started. I'm also getting started post 10 years of schooling, and I deal with very real imposter syndrome, which I think a lot of young people do, and it's not openly discussed. So when it comes to criticism and writing, do you have any advice on powering through self-doubt? I think especially during times like now of uncertainty, misinformation, and millennial anxiety, how can we keep confidence in a voice or finding a voice? Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. That's such
Yeah.
an important question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alexandra?
I mean, it's hard. Like I have to say, like I've been working on trying to write my book, but some days it's really not happening. Like there's a lot of free floating anxiety now. So like I feel for you, and I'm definitely suffering from that also. But in terms of imposter syndrome, I mean, another thing I said at the start was that I think criticism is really personal, and the projects that I've gone most deeply into have started with, you know, objects or memories that I've had that I wanted to think about critically. I mean, and I think the Design of Childhood book is a great example of that. You know, like that wasn't some big topic that like lots of other people were writing about. I was like, hey, wait, like this really interests me, and if it interests me, it will interest other people. So I felt like there was a lot of room for me to write there and to not feel like I was weighed down by other people's words. Like I felt like I could be an expert because it was something that other people hadn't noticed. So I guess I would say, you know, if you're looking for a place to start, or if you're looking for a topic that you can take ownership over, just find something like that that really, you know, speaks to you, that you can observe closely. And I think the truth is that like anything can be a big topic, you know, once you get into it and do your research and like have all of these ideas about it that haven't been expressed in the past. So I guess like one way around imposter syndrome is just to like work around the edges and then find, and what I found is that often like the most interesting topics are around those edges.
So when you find the lane, then you realize that it can actually be much wider and become a boulevard, and then this huge.
Yeah. I mean, I was uncertain about writing about children because I felt like, am I putting myself in this box? Like, I mean, honestly, I was like, am I going to end up writing a mom blog or something like that? Which, I mean, I read a lot of mom blogs, they're great, but that wasn't where I saw myself. And actually, like one of the things that I've been really happy about the book is like a lot of books about childhood and about parenting end up being read and discussed by mothers. But I know that there are a lot of dads, like design dads especially, that have read my book. And that makes me happy because, you know, talking about childhood shouldn't just be for women. I mean, and I think, you know, fathers today, I mean, statistics say, are more involved than they've ever been. So it's like, yeah, there are a lot of places to take that.
Well, that's a great place to stop for all the design moms and design dads out there. It's been such a great conversation. So great to hear your thoughts about this incredible range of topics. I have to say, Alexandra, I'm just going to say this. You are one of my favorite writers on any subject. And it's been such a privilege to have you here on the show. Thank you for being here. It's been really great. And please join us next time for Design in Dialogue. Thanks everyone for joining in.
Yeah.